Republicans now control 30 state legislatures and 31 governorships, and they have complete control of 23 states compared to just 7 for Democrats, and 19 are divided. So I think that does illustrate that many school choice programs could expand in the near future. So I just want to introduce everybody quickly. Let's go down the line. David Welker is with the National Education Association. He is a senior campaign specialist, and he works on the union's charter school policy. Mike Petrilli is...
I'm back.
He's back. He is president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which of course does a lot of work with charters, particularly in Ohio. And since we're in Denver, I can say he is the proud owner of cowboy boots.
That's right.
Are they hand-tooled, though, Mike?
No, and they're very slippery on the snow, as we discussed yesterday.
Yes, not actually efficient for this weather.
Yes.
So Kevin Welner is the head of the National Education Policy Center and a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. He does a variety of research on education policy. And Todd Ziebarth is senior vice president for state advocacy and support at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. So I hope I got everybody's credentials correct. So let's start out with the general kind of yearbook question. After the elections last year and what you've seen in the early going, what are you seeing in terms of the prospects for various school choice policies and programs to expand or change? What are you seeing that excites you? What are you seeing that worries you as you look across the general landscape? And David, why don't we start with you and just go down the line?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, I think there's some jockeying in Capitol Hill on the Senate side or on the House side. We are advocating through both bills for with more money comes more accountability, and we are disappointed with the votes that are coming in so far. First in the bill that passed last year, the House, and the amendments that have gotten through so far to the House version. It is true that charter schools are here to stay. There are many operators like KIPP or like DSST that exist and are proving their mettle, but there are lots of operators that get snuck in under the skirts of DSST or KIPP, and we believe that if those folks are qualifying for federal money or state money, then the accountability measures must be dramatically upped. And at the state level, the real question is that with so many states on one side of the ledger, Republican control, kill the messenger, even if the union is the messenger, we often don't get a fair hearing. And so we have a challenge in trying to work with communities and with parents that these accountability measures on transparency and on reporting are to their best interests as well. And it's not just a special interest that's advocating for these things.
And just a news update on, you mentioned House legislation. I believe that a vote on the House bill to reauthorize ESEA has been delayed. I believe the bill has been yanked as of today. So that will leave more uncertainty in terms of federal policy over this issue. Mike?
Sure. So, well, nice to be back with you all. Many of you were here yesterday to talk about Common Core, where I should say there was some talk about the unions trying to get out of accountability. So it is interesting to hear your comments on charter schools. You know, there is widespread agreement right now about choice, the choice part of the charter school bargain, right? Everybody agrees that parents should have choices, that they should not just be assigned to a neighborhood school. Now, I would argue that Kevin and some of his allies sometimes want to limit those choices. For example, to say, well, we want to make parents choose certain kinds of schools, like schools that are diverse enough or that meet certain other characterizations. But for the most part, there's general agreement out there in the country that parents should have choices. And the debate is, you know, how broad should those choices be? There's now agreement that those should include charter schools. They are here to stay. But the other two parts of the charter school bargain are where the big debates are now. You know, originally, as Caroline was talking about, it was about choice. It was also, though, about autonomy, and it was about accountability. And it's the autonomy and accountability now where we're seeing the big fights in the states and important fights. You know, on the autonomy side, I think we'll talk about this a lot today. There are people out there who are trying to regulate the charter schools and add a lot of new requirements. And look, if, you know, on the one hand, you could look at each individual regulation they want to add and they might be reasonable. But when you add it up, what you end up with are charter schools that end up being regulated just the same as our traditional public schools. And a highly regulated charter school is an oxymoron. Yes, you can go ahead and tweet that. That was yes.
He wants you to tweet it.
Okay. I just love that. I love Twitter. Okay, so we lit it up yesterday. We did pretty good. So we want to do that again. Yeah. So if you want to try to kill charter schools or slow them down or you know, impede their progress, one way is to pile on a bunch of regulations. But there's also, I think, below that more interesting debates because each of the kinds of regulations people are proposing have interesting debates for themselves. So for example, we might talk about discipline over the next couple of days. Should charter schools be required to follow certain rules around disciplining students? That might be reasonable, but it adds a layer. Special education, whether they have to backfill empty seats, on and on and on down the list. When it all adds up, though, my concern is you end up with this Gordian knot that has made it so hard for traditional public schools to improve. And then this question around accountability. The reporters in Ohio know that we at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute are leading the charge to try to clean up Ohio's charter school sector, including being much stronger on accountability and improving charter school authorizing, which is the heart of it. So there are legitimate places where accountability is needed, and those debates play out. But that can also be used as a way to kill charters, and watch the language people use. People talk about accountability to mean all kinds of different things. I mean it as hold them accountable for results in student learning. A lot of other people use that term just to mean regulation.
Kevin, your rebuttal.
Yeah, I wasn't aware this was going to be so much a debate.
Kevin, it's the press. They like conflict. Give them what they want. Come on.
Mike and I
ahead,
agree on 99% of the stuff. He just doesn't know it yet. So, just to since I have a rebuttal, I direct the National Education Policy Center, and we actually have published some fairly concrete, detailed proposals with regard to charter schools. There's a handout that hopefully has made its way around that has a list of a variety of things that we've published. And one of them on there is from Janelle Scott and, it's from Preston Green and Julie Mead, where they outline a sort of an equitable structure of a charter school sector. And the best way to think about it would be the idea of empowering parents to make choices, but within constraints, so that the charter school sector serves larger societal goals. The ultimate goal of charter schools isn't to have parents make choices, it's using parent choices to drive a more equitable, efficient, effective system. So when we think about what's going on right now and the debates around charter schools, I agree with the general idea that the debates have gotten mired way too much into trying to tease out minutia in terms of which sector does better, and I think the debates are much more effective when and useful if we think about issues like access, like quality, and so the issue of accountability was raised earlier. I'll throw out the issue of access, which hopefully we can go back to. I also want to spend some time talking about proposals that are making their way into a lot of different states right now to use a tax credit structure to create voucher systems. And I have some slides that hopefully we can project up here that I can quickly go through that. But around the issue of access really quickly, I think that a lot of what is a really interesting, useful discussion right now is getting to sort of a ground level discussion about what we think charter schools really should be accomplishing. If we think, as Mike Petrilli has said, that stratified elite charter schools are a feature, not a bug. Hope I'm not distorting.
You are, but I will rebut that later.
It's in the New York Times. You might have come across it.
No.
But the specifically referring to issues of school discipline, then that's one view. If you think that charter schools should be serving an equitable swath of the population and not trying to cream off one small group of the population, that's a different thing.
Todd, what are you seeing at the state level on these issues? What would you have to say about that?
So, so the work I do at the Alliance is focused at the state level. We work primarily in states without laws to try to get charter laws on the books, and states with really weak laws to try to strengthen them so they can have an actual charter school movement, and then support a lot of other states as they work to improve their laws. And after the elections in the fall, we felt that the playing field across the country for charters was more friendlier than before the elections. We saw a number of Democratic governors who support us get reelected, such as Andrew Cuomo, Jerry Brown, and the governor here, John Hickenlooper. We saw a number of Republican governors who support us get reelected, like Governors Snyder, Kasich, and Welker up in the Midwest. And then we saw a number of new governors come in, replacing people who were opposed to us, like Governors Hogan in Maryland, Baker in Massachusetts, and Ricketts in Nebraska. So just from that perspective, there were more people in office friendlier to us. However, I think one of the mistakes a lot of people make about this debate is they overestimate the amount of support we get from Republicans, and they underestimate the amount of support we get from Democrats. This is way too often sort of viewed as a partisan thing, and while it's true, Republicans tend to support us more, and Democrats are more challenging to get in behind us. We have pretty strong bipartisan support at the federal level and in a number of states. And in fact, our biggest challenges over the last few years have been in very red states getting Republican supermajorities to enact charter laws or to significantly strengthen them. So on the one hand, we're feeling very optimistic going into these sessions, and we're working today in West Virginia and Alabama and a number of other places. But we're also pretty realistic that these debates are anything but a slam dunk, even when Republicans control states. They still are very challenging.
Yeah, I think the majority of states, the 8 states, right, that don't have charter laws, the majority are controlled by Republicans, I think. So I think that speaks to your point. Maybe we can just tackle the questions, the issues that were raised this way. So you have the principle of charter schools and other choice programs providing options to parents. How do you not undermine that principle while also balancing sort of front-end issues of access and trying to ensure choice to a broad group of people, and also the back-end issues that Kevin raised, which, in trying to ensure quality and who can do the best job of doing it, who should be in the business of doing that. So how do you, which part of that triangle maybe gets too much attention, which doesn't get enough? I'd be interested to hear how you guys debate that. Mike, do you want to take that first?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to say that in terms of the kids that are attending charter schools, in most parts of the country, there is quite a lot of access and equity. Charter school, the charter school populations tend to look a whole lot like the populations of their neighboring public schools. I think that Kevin and some of his allies have been very dishonest on that point and have tried to peddle this argument for years now that charter schools are somehow more racially or socioeconomically segregated than traditional public schools, where that all the best evidence shows that is in most places absolutely not true. In many states, they have laws that say if you want to start a charter school, you have to do it in a high poverty area or in a place where the traditional public schools are not performing well, so ergo they end up locating in the inner city and high poverty areas, and they tend to be very racially and economically isolated, just like the neighborhood schools are, because of course that relates to bigger issues around housing patterns and the like. So when you look at are we doing a good job making sure kids have access to charters? I think we've come a long way. Some cities are better than others, and the key there is making sure there's public information. Some of these single enrollment systems are really promising, like you have here in Denver. It's a great way, so people go in one place to enroll for schools, and they can get information when they're there. In terms of the balance, Andrew, I think the consensus is that it comes down to great authorizing, and there's been a big focus in recent years on how to make sure that we have the right organizations doing the authorizing. We are one of those organizations in Ohio, but which organization should do it? What does it mean to do it well? And how do you regulate the regulators? And those are all great, juicy questions.
Does that sound right to you, Kevin, that the right populations and a fair population of students are getting into these schools, and that really the authorizer question is key to ensuring quality and accountability? What?
So this whole thing about Kevin and his allies, I'm not sure who these allies are. I I think what he's referring to is the entire research community, but I'm not
No,
sure.
you're the unions and other funders of your group.
Maybe we could speak to the recordings and not to each other so much. That would be good.
So the concern in the research community is twofold. One
And part of
is-
the research community.
Like
Right?
what?
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, all right. I'll try to behave.
One concern is simply that when we're trying to make these cross-sector comparisons, we want to make sure we're looking at apples and apples, or oranges and oranges, and so there are some major concerns about trying to use statistical modeling to account for differences when there are elements of those differences that are not in the data sets that you just simply can't control for. So, for example, the whole idea, the whole underlying premise of school choice is that you have a parent or guardian who is understanding the sector, responding to the needs, able to work within the sector. I know that there are people in the charter school sector who have been looking for ways for a couple decades to strengthen that, to find ways to make it so that every child has a parent who can act efficaciously within a school choice system. And I think in some places there have been strides with regard to that, but I don't think you can get around that problem, nor do I think we have. So it's a problem there just in terms of comparison. But there's also an access issue. So even setting aside sort of a research, taking off my research hat and just putting on a policy hat, what is it that we're trying to do with charter schools? Are we trying to create situations at an individual level so that if a parent has the efficaciousness, has the time, the money, that whatever is needed in order to take advantage of a choice, can we accommodate that choice? Can we facilitate that choice? Or are we trying to create a situation where every child, no matter whether he or she has the parent or guardian who can work the system, every child is able to get a high quality education? So those are two separate things that I think both get to this question.
David or Todd, either of you can take this one, or in order. Do you know of a place that struck the right balance between those three sort of things I mentioned, or maybe I'm missing sort of a fourth peg? What would you cite as an example where you can say this is something that is workable and maybe other places can look to as well?
And the three things were access, accountability,
And just upholding the principle of choice.
right. Well, I think it's important to start with a good factual basis on this. Sometimes when I hear criticisms on the access issue, I'm left with the impression that charter schools don't serve any poor kids, any kids of color, any SPED students, or any ELL students. The claims are often quite exaggerated, and I think if you look nationally at the data, we actually serve more low-income kids of color, more ELL kids, and slightly lower percentage of SPED students. And then within SPED, in the various categories, I do think there are some differences, particularly around high needs kids, where charters, the gap is wider. And as I think Mike alluded to, once you get down to the state level or city level, then you do see places where there are issues. Oregon or Utah are places where charters actually serve a much lower percentage of low-income kids of color. And so I do think sort of these broad brush national criticisms around access just aren't accurate, but I do think once you get down to the state and city level, you do see some issues. And I think it's to our benefit in the charter community to recognize those things and work to address them. And I do think, I think if you look at both New Orleans and Washington, D.C. are places where there are lots of charter schools. 90% of the kids in New Orleans are in charters, and in D.C. it's approaching 50%. And as charter schools have taken up such a larger and larger part of the public education sector, these issues around special education and access have just intensified. And I think both of these places have done a good job of recognizing those things and trying to address them, not just denying that special education is a challenge in a place like New Orleans, or denying that it's a challenge in DC, or discipline. I think there was some discipline data from the DC charter schools 2 or 3 years ago that really shined a light on some challenges and some problems there. And I think the sector has tried to address those without over or re-regulating, to Mike's point earlier.
Yeah, and David, maybe you could speak to sort of, I think you've brought up sort of some I don't want to use the word narrow, that minimizes, but things very specific like discipline issues that crop up with respect to charters. Take those together, what do you think they show? I mean, and is the charter sector acting aggressively enough, in the context of what Todd is talking about?
Yeah,
take a shot at the first question on where things are going, and then I'll go to the second one. I mean, the first one would be, I think that there's a direct relationship to how fast the charter sector has grown in a state or a city and the quality. So in places where there has been thoughtful and more slow growth, then you won't find the worst abuses. And in places like Texas or Florida or Arizona, where dozens will open a year and dozens will close per year. Those are real indications that the regulators, the authorizers, the bar is too low for entry. So that would be that's one indicator. On the question of discipline or these others is, again, we have a problem on saying the charter sector when what we're talking about are the individual operations at schools. Some schools are tied to community-based organizations and are run out of basements of churches. And they don't have discipline and they don't have access problems. Some schools have application packages that are available at a country club 1 day a year. That's an access problem. And the problem, of course, is that in this room and with the analysis is if you aggregate things upwards, you lose the ability to find both the positive and the negative anecdotes. And that's really where I think that writers or journalists who go into communities and will do a story about schools in that community that are within a mile of one another and look at practices. And I think that you would find that 90% of the public schools do not have problems on discipline where demerits, accumulated demerits over small infractions result in expulsions. And we know that that is a common practice inside of many charter operators. So these are generalities to a point because we're a national discussion and a national panel. But the writers that are here and the journalists that go into these communities have the ability to sort of separate the high altitude and the low altitude.
I think maybe a related question is, I've wondered sort of the extent to which there's tension between sort of national high-profile operators of charters that many of us are familiar with. The tensions between those groups and groups just operating one charter school in one city, not big-time players on the national stage. I wonder to what extent there are tensions between those that create tensions in communities, and what that might reveal about the movement.
I'll just say, since I've looked at California recently, is that the California Charter School Association does not represent every charter school. There is a second association in the state of California, and they predominantly fall upon the lines of schools that replicate, schools that grow, schools that are growing rapidly, and conversions and or community-based charter operators. And so it is true that the glossy materials and the busloads of students that are bused to state capitals are from an association of one type. But, we in the union recognize without a democratic process, you can't claim that you're speaking for the majority.
Todd, is that an issue to you? Do you guys think about that, or is it just sort of not an issue?
No, I actually think when we think about some of the threats to the continued growth of the public charter school movement, I do think one of them has to do with these issues around transparency, because I do think there are some real challenges there, and there are some operators who are exploiting things and sort of making life miserable for everybody, and there's a threat there.
Like who?
Of states, well, K12 Inc. would be sort of, group
I'm
number
guessing
one.
White Hat would be another.
White Hat would be another. Mike probably can go down the list of Ohio operators who fall
Yes.
into this category.
Econt.
Econt, right.
There's naming names. Good.
And the problem is the full-time virtuals serve huge numbers of kids. So it's one thing if a brick and mortar school serving 200 kids doesn't meet its goals and its charters and has to close. It's another thing if a school of 15,000 students across the state does. So I think these issues around transparency, particularly in the full-time virtual world, are a big threat to the movement. and it behooves us to get on top of them, and that's a big issue that we're working on right now. But the second one is this tension between what we call schools run by management organizations and the independent or mom and pop schools. When the charter movement first started, it was largely focused on groups of people in a community starting a school. And to me, one of the innovations in the charter world is that you often hear that in every district there are islands of excellence, but we can't scale it up and we can't replicate it. Well, the charter movement was the first time where you could actually say, we're running a great middle school, we want to go run another great one. And the ease of, while it's still challenging to replicate that, it at least is easier than trying to convert an existing school to align with what they're doing. So at a certain point in time, you saw schools starting to replicate and expand, create these management organizations. And the challenge is right now, I think some people think within the charter movement, we have the 6 or 8 models and we just need to replicate them and we're fine, which I think is preposterous, because even our best models still have room to improve in some cases by quite a bit. So we need to remain open to new people coming in with even more innovative ideas to accelerate closing the achievement gap.
Mike, if I could pull you away from tweeting.
Yes.
What lessons on that front did you learn from the that you put in your report on Ohio charters? I know you looked into that extensively and found issues. And I would tack on the question, is there sort of an associated tension between charter schools and vouchers? As the voucher sector sort of grows and states begin putting in education savings accounts, is there a tension there as well?
That's an interesting question. I'll take that one first. In general, it's operated the other way, that we know that there have been places where the charter school competition has ended up putting some private schools out of business. And you look at some places where lots of Catholic schools have closed, and I think you can make a pretty good case that the charter school movement contributed to their demise. It's hard to compete with free, and so you see this continued decline of private schools in the inner city, and that helps to explain it. In many cases, the charters are now literally in those old Catholic school buildings. So that's an interesting dynamic. In Ohio, we have this large charter sector, and we have now this growing voucher sector as well. And they seem to be, living right next, side by side to one another pretty well. I don't see a lot of conflict between there. A couple of, well, let me also say that I do agree with Kevin on something he said earlier. First is that we have to be careful how we do compare charter schools to traditional public schools because of these issues of selection bias that about who is choosing these schools. So that's fair. And that we want all schools of choice and all neighborhood schools to be good choices, right? I mean, that's absolutely the goal, is so that you don't want to have a situation where kids are choosing bad schools or they're stuck with bad neighborhood schools. So we agree on that. In Ohio, the focus really has been on the authorizer. Ohio, I would say when you look at the charter sector, the variation's incredibly important. We have some very high-performing charter sectors in places like Boston, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, Tennessee. We could go down the list. And there are some states, and probably Ohio and Michigan and maybe Florida would be towards the top of those lists, where the sectors are quite low-performing. And in Ohio, it's because we have this crazy quilt of authorizing. We have something like 80 different organizations that are in charge of overseeing charter schools. Some of them clearly got into it as a revenue source. They are not doing a good job overseeing charter schools, and they're a problem. And so now the reforms that are being pushed there, endorsed by the governor and by the Republicans in the legislature, are to say we're going to hold authorizers accountable. We're going to put authorizers out of business if they continue to do a bad job with their duties. And I think that is the right place to start. There's also stuff in there around transparency, which is important. There's quite a few charter schools where there have been various financial scandals or schools that have just fallen apart financially, and so that's another area where transparency makes sense. We just have to make sure we get that balance right, that we don't overdo it in a way that ends up, again, just piling on so many more layers of red tape that you stifle these charter schools.
You can't have your cake and eat it too. I mean, Fordham was in Ohio when the laws creating these authorizers was written. So the horse has left the barn and copulated.
It's a nice image that we put out there to the public.
And now,
Can you just tweet that one?
I will retweet anybody.
And now we have a sector that outnumbers your position because so many of your fellow authorizers are a block against your change of heart position in Ohio. And this is the point about how the marketing of good programs brings with it the grifters and the cheats. It's at the inception of these laws that the argument that if you overregulate, you will contain innovation. Well, no. You regulate because you want educators running schools. And in order to have educators running schools, you need to have things like certification that the school administrator or the teachers. And these are all of the layers that after 20-something years, we would say, let's pause and let's look at the conditions that have led to successful schools and enable those, and the conditions that have led to FBI raids at charter schools and limit those.
I completely agree. And when you do that, what you find is in high-performing sectors like Boston and New York and DC and these other places, they're not requiring teachers to be certified. They're not piling on the regulations. They have two things. They have ample funding. Yes, I did say ample funding. I'm a conservative. I said that. And they have very high-quality authorizing. Okay, they do not pile on the regulations. All right, piling on the regulations is what you do if you want to have almost no charter schools, like say in Virginia. If you want high-quality charters, you make sure the right people are doing the authorizing, and you give them the resources to be effective. That, to me, is what most of the evidence says.
David, I'm going to put you on the spot since you sort of raised it as an issue. Are you guys thinking about or planning some kind of push to significantly increase unionization in these charter schools? Is it a good idea? Kevin, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as well. Is that something that you think is worth your time and worth the charter sector?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm an old line organizer, so if you want to know why mining is dangerous, you ask the miners, not the guy at the country club who owns the mine. And so the charter school sector, inside, the teachers are the canaries in the coal mine here. And we know through widespread fear that they are not actively reporting theft, fraud, and abuse. And the reason they don't report it is they're worried about losing their jobs. So from the union's perspective, we would like to say that collective bargaining agreements provide job protection through due process, and some of this would go away. It is a very tricky challenge, in part because of our own rhetoric and what we have said previously, and it is a tricky challenge because our present dues-paying membership does not yet see their colleagues in charter schools as true peers. And that's a very big problem for us. But there is organizing going on around the country, small scale, one shop and two shops. And it has a lot to do with the proposition that charter teachers are not supported by their employer, that they need supports, professional development and other supports, and that union membership and the access to the infrastructure that union has on these issues is a benefit that they'd be willing to pay dues for.
Any thoughts, Kevin?
I mean, I think, so this isn't something I know a lot about, but I know there's the Green Dot charter sector, I think, which is mainly in California, which prefers to have a unionized teaching force. And I've studied a lot of the K12 Inc, which I'm going to be talking about later today, which certainly doesn't have a unionized teaching force. And I think when I look at least what's going on with K12 Inc and see what's a very deprofessionalized teaching force, and a teaching force that has been, at least in the past, put under a lot of pressure to do things that I think are unethical, I could certainly see a benefit of unionization. I want to jump back a little bit, if I can. I think
Sure.
I think it's related.
Jump away.
There's been a lot of discussion, I think, more broadly and today, about expanding or healthy growth of the charter school sector. And one of the things that I constantly struggle with in these conversations is understanding why that's a good thing. Certainly, if we go back to the ideals of the charter school sector, or if we look at places that are doing particularly well. If we look at the best of charter schools, we could understand why we want more of those. But overall, I'm still struggling with why that is what we as a society should be aiming toward in terms of education policy. I can make maybe a little bit of news today because I've been authorized to discuss very briefly a public opinion survey that's going to be released on Tuesday. Some of you might have already gotten some sort of advanced press notice on it. But I got an advanced look at this. It's being released by two groups, In the Public Interest and the Center for Public Democracy. The poll has lots of interesting findings. I'm only allowed to discuss one.
Are those your allies, Kevin? See that you have allies.
Those
Okay.
must be.
All right. Good.
Yeah, neither of them funded by the Walton family.
Yeah, they're friends. Actually, I honestly only know one person from one of these two organizations, so I don't know if that counts.
What are the results?
The poll found that when people were asked about the biggest issues facing K-12 education, lack of school choice came in dead last, with only 10% choosing it as among the two big issues on their mind. That's far behind issues like, and this is why I bring this up, lack of parental involvement, too much stress on standardized tests, cuts to school programs, and class size. And so I just keep thinking why. I mean, obviously, it makes sense to discuss it because it's an important issue that people in the media are covering. But what I keep struggling with is why is growth of school choice in general or growth of charter schools such a high priority? And I think that when we talk about these things, we shouldn't assume that.
While Kevin thinks about that question, I want to give you guys ample time to ask yours. So if you could just make sure that you identify yourself before you ask your question, that would be great. So, Eric, did you want to?
Okay.
Can I also just the quick answer, Kevin, is that so many people have.
That was sneaky right there.
Thanks. Well, yeah, just filling time. Just so many people have tried to fix big urban districts and failed, and it's worth continuing to try. But I think that is for a lot of people is the answer is that we just cannot seem to figure out how to make in most places big urban systems work. And so if we can improve public schooling through charter schools, then that's why so many of us are trying to pursue that path.
Question.
Hi, I'm Doug Livingston with the Akron Beacon Journal. I know there's been a lot of talk about Ohio. You mentioned White Hat. It's one of our Akron companies. And I want to talk about the reform talks that are happening at the State House. And, excuse me, I'm wondering if you think that cracking down on the sponsors is going far enough, considering that some of the companies you mentioned, ECOT, K12, are folded into portfolios that could be hidden or masked their performance because other schools are performing so well within that portfolio.
Mike, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the proposals Fordham's put forward, I mean, there's a lot of them on authorizing, but there's certainly other issues as well. I mean, look, Ohio needs a top-to-bottom overhaul of its charter school sector, I think fixing authorizing is job number one, but there are other jobs to do as well.
The other problem that you have in Ohio is that by design, the charters were to be in the 8 urban districts. And this is, again, sort of in contrast. I would be happy to stipulate, if Mike would, that we will push for growth on charter schools in only urban big systems. But I don't think the industry is satisfied with that. In Ohio specifically, part of the recent problem has been that the online schools are drawing more and more enrollment from the non-urban districts. And with it is the money flow. And with the money flow comes shortages. And with shortages impacts the 95% of the students in the non-charter system. And so the political implications are that if you cage charter schools, then politically you can go for a while. But if the charter underperformance can be demonstrated outside of the other people's neighborhoods, then there is a larger political price to pay.
So if I just respond a little bit to the question.
Sure.
The issue earlier was raised around accountability, but I think there's a related issue of transparency, and I think that as we move forward into the next legislative sessions, this issue of transparency for charter schools and the companies that are closely connected with the management organizations might become more and more important. So the idea about what's going on in Ohio is in part that we can't tell what's going on in Ohio, right? We can't tell with regard to a lot of the specifics. Who is taking what money where, and then also issues of actual results. And so I think that open meeting laws, financial reporting, just general good governance transparency, which is connected to accountability but isn't the same thing. And I think that, getting to Mike's point, isn't really going to tie up charter schools in knots in sort of a bureaucratic way that I think there'd be a concern about, sort of tighter restrictions that charter schools largely would, that the design of charter schools is to get around. I think transparency is a separate issue, and I think that good governance and good, I don't know, I'm actually interested to hear what Todd has to say about this, because it seems like there is a good governance issue.
Yeah, so we put out a model law in 2009, and we took the opportunity at that point to sort of look at what had worked and what hadn't, and sort of said, if we're going to create a law from scratch, what would it look like? And addressed a bunch of different issues and really strengthened authorizing requirements and accountability requirements for schools and authorizers, and we're actually, and continue to be criticized by some within the charter movement as being over regulating too much on some of those things, but we actually think it strikes the right balance. And within that model law, we require charter school governing boards to abide by open meeting and open record requirements. We think these are public entities and they should abide by them. The question is really, what do you do with the schools that contract with management companies? And should those companies have to abide by the same open record and open meeting requirements? And you have to remember that 75% of the charter school movement of the 6,700 schools or so are the mom and pop independent charters. So most of the schools are abiding by this anyways. And actually all of the school, even those who contract with the management companies, their school governing boards are abiding by all this. It's just, is the management company having to abide by open meetings and open records? And that actually looks different in each state because those decisions are made within the confines of how laws treat these sort of quasi-public entities like these management companies that are private entities but carrying out a public function largely. So I think there is a lot of debate and discussion around that piece of transparency. Not should charter school governing boards have to abide by open meetings and open records, it's really the management companies, and do they have to abide by it?
Other questions?
So Eric Roblin from EWA, on the sort of politics piece of this. So Ohio, we've talked about, maybe Michigan and a few of the other states where there seem to be an awful lot of low-performing charters that remain open year after year. Why has it taken this long for policymakers to come around and be more aggressive on accountability? And should we expect any of that action in this coming year or the next year? And are there particular states to watch where you think policymakers are going to get more serious about taking care of those situations where you have schools that probably by now, many charter advocates would say should not be open any longer?
Here's what you need to know about Ohio. The two largest campaign contributors in the state are the teacher unions to the Democrats and the owner of an e-school, an e-charter school, to the Republicans. Okay, that explains why there has been this challenge politically in Ohio for so many years. Okay, and finally, we've been working hard, and we've got our partners there in Ohio have been working hard to tee up some reforms. We finally have a new speaker in the House. We have Republicans in the legislature finally willing to tackle this. And we also now have a Republican governor who just won by 30 points, who's putting his political capital behind it. So I'm confident that we're going to get some major charter reform in Ohio. I think just to say that, with some context, there were other states that were also had real problem spots, and I'd say Arizona and Texas especially, and they have largely cleaned up their charter sectors or come a long way. So it shows that it can be done. The charter sector has shown a remarkable ability to self-correct.
Yeah, what would you say to that, Todd?
I would say one of the other tensions in the charter movement, and I think it is evident in some of the states you mentioned, Eric, is that there are a variety of perspectives that would answer Kevin's question of why are we doing this and how should we do it. And within the charter movement, there is, in some of these states, that question was answered by folks who were very strong on the free market perspective. So a very low barrier to entry for operators and let the market sort things out. Even as quality issues emerged in some of these places, that was a predominant mindset within the charter movement and some of the politicians who supported it. I think in some other states, Mike mentioned Arizona and Texas, you had people within the charter movement who actually, I mean, obviously the empowering parents and creating some market dynamics is a key part of this, but also having some government through authorizers regulate this and hold people accountable for results is also an important part of it. And so I think in some states, the charter movement has been able to push on some things, even though there's that mindset there. But in other places, that free market mindset, we need to let the market sort things out, has overly influenced the discussion.
Kevin, do you see policymakers in particular, which I think Eric was speaking to, do you see them learning any lessons, and taking action? Do you expect any of that? Would you point to anything on that front?
So when I've had policymakers reach out to me, the end result has usually been the policymaker coming back to me about a month and a half later saying, the charter sector here is too strong and they don't want any progress, and they don't want any sort of movement toward equity and access, which is why I was contacted in those cases. So I think when I look to Todd, I think I'm looking to Todd in part because I think progress has to come from within the movement, from the charter school authorizing organization and from the charter school organizations, to decide that the future health of charter schools is, as Todd was saying, sort of moving away from a market magic model and moving toward a model that says, what are our ultimate goals as a society, and how can charter schools as a tool help to accomplish those goals?
Yeah,
I would
just quickly.
I think
yeah.
that even in the nature of the conversation that we've had so far, is sort of talking about the policies that would impact the management and financial operations of the schools. In many senses, the politicians and the policymakers aren't going to get into the question of should someone use core knowledge or some other curriculum or and so the point being that the charter schools were intended to create innovative programs. And we don't really have a great policy discussion about, is a blended learning program where a third grader spends 75% of his time in front of a computer system, is that good education? We are in, as you hear in the course of this conversation, a conversation about what needs to happen so that there is less fraud in the charter system. And so we're comfortable from the union's perspective to saying, if that conversation is on the operations side, we have a lot to contribute. But the question is, are the schools performing as intended? Meaning, are they outperforming the schools that they want to replace?
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Martha Dalton with WABE in Atlanta. And you'd mentioned the management companies that partner with some charter schools. And I report in Georgia, obviously, where charters are considered public schools. But there is this sort of criticism, this kind of drumbeat from critics, saying that when management companies come in and want to sort of run these schools, that it's an attempt to privatize the public system. Can any of you on the panel sort of address that? I mean, is that a common criticism? Is it fair?
I'd say it's common. I'm not sure if it's fair. I mean, it sort of depends on how you define a public school. I mean, we sort of view a public school as, don't charge tuition, don't have admission requirements, don't teach religion, have to abide by the state standards, the state tests, have to abide by civil rights laws, health and safety, those kinds of things. And charters meet all of those requirements. And I think there's one of the issues from some people is, do charters have democratically elected boards? If you define public schools as only those schools controlled by a democratically elected board, even if that board was elected by 5% of the population, which is the case in a number of districts, that I think is one of the issues that some people feel public schools have to be absolutely controlled by democratically elected representatives. And obviously some charter schools are authorized by school boards, but even those schools are controlled by a nonprofit governing board. But from our perspective, all of the most important pieces of public schools in terms of enrollment, admission requirements, all those things, they meet them. In fact, I think they're more public than magnet schools in a lot of places because a lot of magnet schools actually test kids before they get in and only let those in who have a certain GPA.
So,
How useful is the P
So-
word?
There's actually, those of you who are interested in that topic, there's a professor at the University of Connecticut named Preston Green, who's the co-author of the piece I mentioned earlier. He's put out a law review articles within the last year looking specifically at how courts have treated charter schools. And courts treat charter schools as private in some ways and as public in some ways. So for example, courts have treated the employees, the teachers in charter schools as private employees. In terms of contracting, and there are some real interesting issues in terms of students and students' due process rights that pop up also that are, I think, at this point undecided. There's no question that if you think about something like K12 Inc. or the White Hat or Life Skills Schools with White Hat or some of the other for-profits, that there are some major issues about the private role. And the issues of transparency certainly come into play there, but also the issues of just profiting, getting large profits over taking in taxpayer money to educate kids and not using all that money to educate the kids. I think the issues are still there with regard to nonprofits, not quite as salient, but certainly there, and partly because of the way courts treat different elements of what the schools are doing. The issue of local democratic control, I think, can become important if decisions are made far away from the community. I mean, if voter turnout were the criterion we used, then we didn't just have a switch over in the Congress, right? I mean, there was a low voter turnout. We still treat that as a democratic election. And I think that being able to go to your local principal, your local school board, your superintendent, and petition, and basically say, this is an issue we have, is an issue of democratic control and of community engagement and community power.
I want to get to as many questions as we can. Who has the mic? Lots of questions.
But not a lot of tweeting. Come on, guys. What's going on? You tired? Get some coffee.
Hi, I'm Grace, and I'm from Chalkbeat, Tennessee, and y'all are welcome to roll your eyes at this question and say it's totally irrelevant, but I'm a
Guys,
history
don't roll
major,
your
so I
eyes.
have to ask it. So when we're talking about the politics of school choice, obviously that's changed a lot in the past 4 decades. When we were talking about this 60s, 70s, maybe even 80s, there was a lot about race, school choice. The way it started, kind of, from my understanding, is like saying that you're allowed to choose what race the people you went to school with were. And obviously charter schools are no longer, or never were, bastions for white segregationists, and I don't think anyone would argue that. But is that history still relevant when we're looking back at the politics of school choice, or as reporters reporting on the day-to-day, should we kind of divorce that?
No, I think it's a good question. And when you look at some of the Deep South states that have been debating charter schools, Alabama is the big one right now, and that is absolutely on the minds of a lot of people. That history is real, that there were these segregation academies, and they still exist. There's many places that you go, and I was in Mississippi recently. You go to plenty of towns where still most of the white kids in a given town go to a private school that was set up, as a way to escape desegregation. So I think that is relevant. I think it is not at all representative of what you see throughout the charter school system, which is that, on the whole, these schools tend to be very representative of the communities they serve.
Yeah, Andrew, if I can jump in on that.
Yeah.
I started working on this stuff in the mid-'90s, right as the charter school movement was taking off. And a lot of the criticisms at that point around race had to do with the fact that some folks said these charter schools are primarily going to serve white, wealthy, middle-class kids. And in fact, just the opposite has occurred. We disproportionately serve low-income kids of color. And we still get criticized by the same people who raised those criticisms before. I think the questions around race are absolutely relevant to the discussion and should be talked about in the right context. But it's just, I think it's important to note that there was a concern that these would be white, middle-class, wealthy schools, and in fact, just the opposite has occurred mostly across the country.
So, I'm sorry, could I jump in?
Quickly.
I like
yeah.
the question in part because it lets me put my lawyer hat on, which I always enjoy doing. So the case, the U.S. Supreme Court case of Green versus New Kent County, Virginia, was the one where the school choice was originally used as a way to avoid a desegregation mandate. I think in a lot of ways it's not useful to think about that history because for a lot of reasons it's different people trying to do something different. But I also think, and I'll wade into the challenge here, I think that the issues not of segregation but of stratification are extremely important. Here in Colorado, charter schools used to be, as Todd knows, charter schools here in Colorado used to overwhelmingly serve a white population, and that has shifted over time. That in Boulder, where I'm from, charter schools were initially used as a way to avoid the what's called the Carnegie Middle Schools reform, which involved middle school detracking. And basically parents said, no, I don't want my kids in a detrack class. I'm going to create, and this is very simplified, but this is part of what was going on. I'm going to create my own charter school, and we're going to escape this. Charter schools can serve that sort of function. They can also, and oftentimes do, serve a function of providing some sort of enriching opportunity within an urban area. And a lot of what we see in terms of the overall broad swath, the top line numbers in terms of who's enrolling in charter schools depend overwhelmingly on where they're located. It's location, 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 right? And so looking at those top line figures doesn't help us as much as going into the community and seeing what's taking place within the community. And that's where issues of selection bias and other access issues come into play. And that's why I say stratification is important, because it's largely stratification by parental efficacy, which is not tied directly to race. Right? And so you could have an all African American community where different parents or different kids are represented by different parents with different levels of education and wealth and access.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm Ali. I'm from the San Antonio Express News. My question is actually, I think, pretty much tied to the last question. You've mentioned kind of specific cities or locations where access is an issue and maybe isn't as equal as it should be. But are there networks, maybe even spanning multiple states, that any of you think are doing it wrong in terms of creaming or not having accessibility what it should be? And if the answer is yes, then what should be done about that?
And who should do it? Yeah, who wants to take that one?
So in Texas, you have both statewide and national actors. And because in Texas the law is that you have the ability to open multiple campuses under single charters, then the path to replication is pretty easy. And the nature of some of those admissions policy changes. Once you don't put into your charter application what you're actually going to do. And then once you get your charter and you replicate, then you sort of are in the opportunity to catch me if you can admissions policies. So the Harmony schools that are in Texas, which are Turkish run and claim to be STEM focused, they have a different set of policies. For example, no transportation offered. So on a policy level, if you don't offer busing, where do you think the kids are going to come from? Now, they might come from walking across the street, but they will also be coming from families whose parents can afford to drop them off and pick them up on a regular basis. If you have a policy that does not offer after-school care, you will have a different socioeconomic status. So it is in part what Kevin just said on location, but it is also in part on practices. And so the chains don't let a lot of that flexibility at the school level, so I don't believe that any of the chains are telling them you can or cannot have aftercare. But if the chain does have a central policy, there is no aftercare, then you can be sure that the enrollment there is a different nature than what you got at the neighborhood school.
Mike, did you have any?
Just checking though, last time I checked the NEA represents teachers in magnet schools. Then you represent teachers in affluent areas that you can consider to be private public schools, places where you have to buy expensive homes in order to go there.
And 300 charter schools, yes, we do.
So I'm just curious. It just seems a little hypocritical to speak
we don't
out.
run the schools. We represent the teachers in the schools.
Right. You're not saying that it's something's wrong with these neighborhood public school systems that say, you know, you have to live within the boundary, and that means buying an expensive house in order to go there. I just want to point out that that seems hypocritical. Let me also ask, I mean, did nobody else, why did you mention that it's Turkish run? What does that have to do with anything?
It's a fact.
It just seems to me a little out of line.
Other questions? I think there was one in the back over there.
Any number of you have mentioned over the course of this discussion, and probably for years, charters, schools point to success of students, or say that's in part a selling point. Our kids succeed, do better than the local public school, and we, all of us, love to look at, well, some of us like it more than others, look at data and statistics to say, here's the proof. And damn if getting that proof is the hardest thing for me to find. Except in a few research institutions, others are funded by X foundation, Y foundation with a bias. So who might you suggest we go to look at some stats somewhere that say, yeah, these schools succeed doing X, Y, Z, these charters, these public schools. Because in general, it's, yeah, some do really well, some don't. And it's kind of reflective of what the non-charter public schools do. Any ideas? I'm looking for some source or sources, reliable, objective, I can go to.
We just have a couple of minutes, so if you guys could just rattle off a couple of quick sources that you like.
Credo.
Credo, there you go.
Well, it depends on how timely you want it. I mean, if you want NCES data, which is the gold standard, which is a couple of years old, reporting on a real time is very difficult. But it is a question of both reporting in the school district way and in the charter school way. I don't hold out hope that the Common Core or any of these other standardized tests will allow for real-time data analysis. But I would say that schools that are in existence for a couple of years, the NCES is the gold standard.
And these are the same problems you're going to encounter with any school. It doesn't have to be a charter school, of course. The issue of using test scores to judge quality is a separate issue that probably you discussed a little bit yesterday. But obviously it's a very narrow measure, and there are lots of limitations on that. We did a study looking at New York charter schools, trying to sort of explore this issue of how well they're doing and why. And what we found was that the schools that seemed to be doing the best by test score measures were doing a lot of really interesting things with additional resources. So longer school days, additional sort of class size reductions, different ways of improving the opportunities to learn within the school. So this isn't what you asked, I know, but I'm trying to divert it. The part of the question of what's going well or which school is doing better really, I think, should be what is the school doing, and trying to understand and flesh out the full story, and what sort of the issue of money and resources is important. What are they able to do, and how are they able to do it?
Todd, good sources.
The National Alliance for Public Charter Schools.
Wait a minute.
No, I do think a few. Credo, if you look at their report, they do try to get at this disaggregation about which kids in particular seem to be succeeding in charters, in which states in particular, in which cities. I think that's helpful. I think RAND has done some good work over the years, but it's a little bit dated. And I think the Center for Reinventing Public Education, I see Robin Lake is going to be here tomorrow. I think they've tried to approach these issues in a productive way.
You're asking at the school level, right? So I'm not sure if I understood. Yeah. At the state level, there are better options, but at the school.
Then on the operations side, is many of these charter schools have audits, and they have IRS tax form 990s. There's a number of things that are on the operational side. But on the academics, on the enrollment, on the demographics, you're a year or two lag time at best.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all of our panelists, and please